hell is up with grad school and isolation? Maybe some mental health issues. This is a little bit different than normal. This is the Ask Me I'm a Scientist, but this week we're going to do Ask Me I'm a Grad Student. I'm so excited for our guest today. Kind of switching gears, but we're still talking to a scientist. And we're hopefully going to be answering some of your questions about what our experiences were, having some conversation, just like we always do with Ask Me I'm a Scientist. And so let's get started. So in addition to being a rock star PhD candidate in biochemistry at UCLA, Fay Lin is the super active advocate for graduate student mental health. And maybe you know her from Twitter. Her handle's going to show up here in a second. I'm not even going to try saying it. But she works so hard to just talk about some of the really key issues that graduate students face while they're in grad school and while they might be dealing with different aspects of mental illness, and just starting this conversation that is so important. This is something that's really near and dear to my heart. I will tell you, Fay is a good friend of mine. She's absolutely amazing, and it's a bummer that we live on opposite coasts, but really excited that we can stay in touch and talk through this lovely platform, which is the internet. So I could just talk about Fay forever, but instead, let's talk to Fay. Hey, Fay, how's it going?
Hi, Susanna.
How is it over there? We're at a 3-hour time difference, yeah?
Yeah, it's 5 o'clock for me. It's still sunny out. I'm in LA. So yeah, how's it going for you? It's 8?
It is 8. It is 8 o'clock. It is 8:02, so it's not going too badly, a little bit late. So let's see. I'm over here managing the chat. Feel free, anybody, to pop on and ask questions. We've got a bunch of questions coming in from Twitter and Instagram, which is really cool. But first, Fay, why don't you, I'm going to make you kick us off. Can you tell us, interesting. Rob Ulrich is here. Hi, Rob. Can you start us off with what was one time you felt isolated in grad school? Or actually, what does isolation mean to you?
Yeah, so this is such a great question, and I'm so excited to talk about it as the focus of today's show. So when I think about isolation, I think 2 themes come to mind for me. One is being surrounded by people, but not having strong connections to those people. Humans are naturally social creatures, and it's very valuable to be surrounded by healthy support networks where you feel heard and understood. That's why social distancing can be very difficult. During this time, not everyone has the privilege of a support network right now, or are surrounded by people where they don't feel that connection, or people will bring them down. And finding new support networks during social distancing can be especially challenging. Yeah. And the second theme that I also think about is being alone with limited access to other people. So for me, if we're talking about personal experiences in grad school, that was the reality when I moved across the country from New York to here in LA to start grad school with no family, friends, or partner. And it was scary and hard work. And along the way, I definitely ran into my fair share of mistreatment, disrespect, and invalidation that was very hard to deal with alone. At the same time, I also want to talk about today how I got through it. And what I also realized is that you don't need other people to be okay. You have strength and resilience on your own. You don't need a partner. You don't need external validation. And when we talk about isolation, I do think about, 1, empowering everyone that they are enough on their own, and 2, tips for building a support network, because it can be tough. So everyone out there does deserve support, but I want to normalize that it may take some resilience and perseverance to find your people. And ultimately, whether or not you have a support network right now is nothing to do with your self-worth. And I think that's something I in the past internalized a lot. But ultimately, self-worth is not something that's up for debate.
Yeah. I mean, I love that you're bringing all these pieces together, because I think ultimately it's not just one thing at a time, right? It's not just, oh, I'm isolated right now. I'm dealing with some concerns about my grad school, or I'm not able to see my friends. It kind of forces us into this place where we have to deal with what we think about ourselves. And that is really hard. That's something that I think we've all struggled with, but definitely, I've talked openly, you've talked openly about dealing with struggles with mental illness. Um, it can be really, really scary to be isolated.
Yeah, for sure. I think for sure as scientists in academia where there's a lot of pressure to be productive, and already when we don't talk enough about mental health struggle, it's just really hard to be open about those sorts of things that may impact our productivity. So it's a lot going on, especially as a grad student.
Yeah. Yeah. So I want to go back to this because, first of all, anyone who's watching who does not follow Faye, please go ahead and follow her on Twitter because she is just this lovely, refreshing voice of honesty and also just talks so openly about a lot of the things that she has faced at grad school, which are unfortunately a lot of things that other people face. What she was saying about having to move, having different places of not being treated well. Um, but I do want to, for people who haven't heard much about it, I would love to just get a little more of your perspective of how it was moving across the country and, how that kind of ties into what you're having to deal with now.
Yeah, yeah. So, like Susanna said, I talk a lot about mental health on Twitter, and the key experience that I go back to is this move across the country. So, I'm originally from New York. I went to NYU for undergrad, and I actually came straight from undergrad to grad school. And before the start of grad school, I was already struggling a lot with my mental health. During my last semester of undergrad, I was officially diagnosed with major depressive disorder,
Woo!
and and I was struggling to a point where I almost didn't graduate because I withdrew from many of my classes and was only taking a bare minimum to get my degree. So it really wasn't a good time to uproot myself to start a PhD, but regardless, that's what I
Hmm.
did. And I ended up moving here to UCLA to start my PhD in biochemistry.
Mm.
And I look back on that first year and I think about the experience of having no support network or safety net when you're already struggling is really terrifying.
Hmm.
And the fact that I was struggling with a heavily stigmatized topic in academia like depression did make it that much harder. So one of the struggles, for example, I went through that I also talk about openly on Twitter, was starting antidepressants, which is
Mm.
scary to do alone, especially because for me it brought about a lot of side effects. For example, most notably, I remember just sleeping for hours. And in my program here at UCLA, we have to rotate, take classes, NTA, all during our first year, and it's really not a good time to be asleep. So So at the time, I didn't feel comfortable telling my professors or peers about what I was going through because you are afraid of being called weak or all of those stigmatizing comments that you hear all the time. There were also times I did open up and I was still shamed for showing up late to class because I was struggling with my health. And I remember it being really isolating to reach out for help and be invalidated about mental health struggle.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, and
But
I feel like now, it's to put yourself out there right now, you have to not only overcome the barrier of saying it, but you actually have to actively reach out. It's pretty hard for people right now to even know to ask, like, hey, are you doing okay? Because first of all, no one's doing that well. Given the circumstances, I think people can be doing really well, but um, to be able to go and say, hey, things aren't okay right now, or I freaking loved your tweet earlier that was like, um, saying that you already have so many Zoom calls lined up one day is enough reason to say no to a Zoom call. Things like that, where it's so easy for us to just smash it down or to just not say anything. Um, I think that it seems like that's a big problem right now. How do you kind of keep going with this openness? How do you keep talking about this, and how have you learned to kind of do these things?
yeah, no, that's such an important point that it's really not easy to talk about this stuff. And what I just described was my first year of grad school, and I'm a fourth year now. And I think I really started, I think Twitter I started maybe a year ago, but it still took me from that time, my first year, maybe it was like my third year or something. It was a couple years of time until I felt comfortable on a public platform saying something like, I struggle with depression, and I think still now saying this on a live show still stirs up some sort of nerves, or it's not still not completely like uh comfortable, and that I think is important to say, especially as someone who has been so open, that it is still
Oh,
hard.
absolutely.
Um, what has helped, I think, is keeping in mind resilience because, like I said, there were so many times where I did reach out, but was invalidated or just didn't get the support that I needed at that time. And that was kind of discouraging. And I can imagine that there were many times I didn't want to keep reaching out because I wasn't getting the help that I was looking for. But I think what I learned was this perseverance. Like I talk about how tough it was that first year, but flash forward to present day, I'm currently a fourth year grad student who found an extremely supportive lab academically and in wellness. Great friends who I feel comfortable being vulnerable around and who don't stigmatize
Mm.
me. And I'm in my fourth year, and it took, look back at it, it did take some time, I think, to get to a place where I am comfortable and feel like I am supported. And at the time, for me, it meant moving. And when I just started at this new place, it's really scary not to have support. And then also scary the idea of it might take a long time to build. What I want to tell people is that everyone deserves support, and it might also take resilience, but don't be discouraged if you don't find these people right away.
So I want to ask, like, based on that, because it is so crucial to actively, even when it's really hard, reach out. And um, how do you think, based on what you've learned, how do you think people can go about doing that, especially in this time? How do you actively find support when you can't just bump into somebody and grab a coffee with them or something like that?
Yeah, during social distancing,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. Yeah, I know, especially nowadays, I think about the idea of taking initiative.
Mm.
So me and Susanna were talking about how these virtual calls are still have very similar experience of being in person. It's not exactly the same. There are definitely differences, but I think it can still be really powerful to just reach out to someone and say, "Hey, do you want to do a Zoom call?" Which would be similar to saying, "Hey, do you want to get coffee if we're meeting up
It's true.
in person?" And this this idea of initiative comes to mind. And I know that's not always easy for people to ask, and even if it's not necessary for like help on a serious crisis situation, but just asking for coffee can still be not that easy. And I know personally because it took me some practice before I got comfortable with the idea of reaching out to people just to chat.
Yeah.
So what I want to, I guess, empower people to do is reach out more and not be afraid of people maybe saying no to that. Because I
Yeah.
think in the past, I definitely asked people to chat and maybe they turned me down. I was like, oh no, like,
They hate me.
like
I'm
what are they,
awful. No one wants to hang out. Yeah.
right? You internalize that. Um, but yeah, it's just, I do want to empower people to reach out. And there are definitely people out there who will support you. And again, it goes back to this idea of resilience and perseverance. I think that's what helped me a lot because it gave me strength to face those people who weren't supportive, and then also made me realize that there are great people out there if you look for them.
Yeah. Well, and like you were saying, I don't think we should get so discouraged when somebody says that they can't, because there's tons of times, like there's so many people, especially right now, who are needing support. Um, that there's people right now that I just don't have time to answer everybody. And one thing that's really important for me is that I don't say, oh yeah, reach out to me anytime and I'll totally answer and support you, because I can't. And I think that's one of those topics we should, if people are interested in having us do more of these, we should definitely talk about is setting your own limits for supporting others. But it's certainly not a reflection on them. I'm not even prioritizing people. It's sort of just like who ends up in my schedule first, and that's who I'm going to be talking to. And I really like your point about don't take it personally. Don't feel bad. Don't, if you get a no, that's not about you. It might just be that they are respecting their own boundaries, and certainly doesn't mean you shouldn't try again with another person. So I want to make sure that we get to some of these questions because we've got them rolling in. And first, Rob had one which we have to get to because I think it's so important with this right now. Rob said, "How can we combat Zoom fatigue?" And I think that that ties into all of this with we have a lot of, I feel a lot of pressure to connect with people, to be chatting, to be constantly doing stuff. And I love it. And this is actually, for me, much more comfortable than in-person meetings. But at the same time, I, I get exhausted. How about you? Like, how are you feeling with all of these different calls?
Yeah, for sure. I think definitely like during the first few weeks when we were transitioning for all our meetings to Zoom, I just felt completely exhausted after that first week. I was just like, what is it about this virtual space that is just so draining? Um, and yeah, I think this is a really important topic to talk about now. How are we going to navigate our new reality with social distancing and relying mostly on these virtual calls? I think like, we were talking about boundaries, and I think another boundary that is important is how many calls you schedule for yourself,
Mm-hmm.
each day, and kind of knowing that if it is too much, be kind to yourself and then let yourself maybe say no to a call if you can.
Yeah.
Or something like, I always like telling people if they're hosting a Zoom call, don't really pressure people to turn on their camera. And there's, a lot of reasons why people wouldn't feel comfortable turning on their camera. And I think
And
if
also, it
you really,
doesn't guarantee that people are going to pay attention. Like, it just guarantees that you're going to watch them not pay attention.
right, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So I think as we're navigating this virtual space, we're also learning about how to interact with each other, how to use like the mic, the chat, the camera in a way that is effective but not uncomfortable for people.
Feel free
Um,
also,
and I think,
like my therapist suggested this because we've been doing Zoom calls. If it gets distracting, put a sticky note over your face in the screen because like she was saying, this is a really big issue, especially if, you deal with any sorts of negative self-talk or, maybe even body dysmorphia issues. Even just don't want to see your face anymore. It's so distracting that she's like, just put a sticky note over it. You don't need to see your face. You're in the screen. It doesn't matter. You don't need to be in the exact middle. So tips like that I think are just so crucial.
yeah, yeah, that's a really nice tip. I'm glad you shared that.
Yeah, well, I was just like, this is horrible. And she's like, I know. Um, so I've got a question from Jaden. They say, how has social media helped or influenced your mental health journey? And I wanted to ask this one because going back to that point of there's actually really great connections you can make through the internet, but then there's also this like deluge of everybody's talking to everybody all the time. How has social media affected kind of your mental health journey, and what have you learned from that that you can apply to this situation?
Yeah. So most of my social media interactions, I would say, are on Twitter. And from my Twitter experience, I think it also varies on the social media platform. I think on Twitter, we have more of these transparent conversations about if it's mental health or other sorts of topics that are harder to talk about in person, which I really like about Twitter. I think it has become a space where I do feel maybe even more transparent on Twitter versus in real life sometimes, because it does foster this open space for that sort of topic to be
Mm-hmm.
discussed. And with with that sort of space, I think is really valuable right now because you can openly share about what you're struggling with during social distancing. And in real life, I think it's not as, at least from my experience, it's not as easy to find those spaces. So in that respect, I think Twitter has been very...
You can't exactly just roll up into a coffee shop and be like, I'm so sad today, I didn't get out of bed, and have 40 people be like, same.
Right? It's such a unique space, I think, on depending on what type of social media you're on, right? And I think because it's something that helps a lot right now, talking about struggle, Twitter is something that has helped me a lot. At the same time, you can look at situations where I think you mentioned being too engulfed in social media and have it not necessarily having positive impact, but be more of a distraction. Right. And I think it's also important to put boundaries and know yourself. If you want to take a break from something, it might take some discipline or some perseverance to kind of know, like draw your boundaries with that. But I think it does come down to knowing about like what your needs are, what kind of platform will help with that, because I don't want people to be discouraged from using social media because it has so many benefits that I love. I mean, I really love the Twitter community that I've gotten to know over the past year that I've been on Twitter.
Yeah, there's some just amazing people out there. And actually, I mean, we're seeing it right now in the chat. I know that you can't see it right now, but people asking great questions and chatting. So I think that really just shows what amazing people exist out there. And to that idea that one of the benefits of being online is that there's pretty much always somebody out there at exactly that same time who's dealing with very similar situations. You and I have talked about it, that we're across the country, and some of our situations we've been able to share with each other that we don't feel like we could share with almost anybody else, especially just kind of around us.
Right.
All right.
Yeah.
So, wow, there's so many good questions. Oh, I do want to, you said that there were some good ones on Twitter, so I want to make sure that we can get to some of those. Ugh, I love people. Okay. Um, let's see. So I've got one, and Matthew DeForest is also in here, is a huge supporter of all the Ask Me's, and I think is really important because also Anthony Burnt asked a similar question. But Matthew says, how do you recommend partners and good friends best support those dealing with these issues? And similarly, Anthony said, how can I, as a more senior scientist, support mentees and trainees? So I guess that's a good question of, when someone does reach out, what can someone else say? Or based on our previous conversations, what shouldn't you say?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, this is so important. I think we talk a lot about how, if you are struggling, how to get the help. But this other aspect of how do you support someone is just as important. And we should equip ourselves to be there for someone if they do reach out. This idea of communication, having clear communication, comes to mind, and also clear, respectful communication. So one that could be communication about what if you're the person trying to support someone who has just reached out to you, trying to identify maybe concrete ways that you can help. And then this other aspect of communicating your own boundaries when it comes to helping someone. I think I've definitely fallen into that trap where I didn't put boundaries on my bandwidth and how much energy I put into helping others. And then I just end up being burned out, which then ends up not helping anyone, because then I don't have the ability to put more energy into supporting people who need it. So I think it's super important to just start with clear, open communication. And I think it's probably some topics to touch upon are ways to validate people who reach out so that they feel comfortable talking about whatever it is that they're facing right now, and also respectful ways to communicate your boundaries. Because, for example, it's one way to say, I'm here to support you, but my limits are XYZ versus you take up too much of my time, right? And I think too often we have to keep in mind that how we say things matters so much. And we need to equip ourselves with ways to communicate that get the message across, but also make people feel supported.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that my partner and I have been working on because we are stuck together quite a lot is actually I statements. So this is the idea of you say, I feel blank when this happens. It's not, I feel blank when you do this, or you're making me angry, or this pisses me off, or whatever. It's saying, this is how I'm feeling when this happens. And so I think that one of the most important things that friends and family and loved ones is to start practicing them themselves and start being kind of demonstrate and model kind of, I'm using air quotes, good behavior in terms of, what does it look like to be vulnerable and to share your feelings of even just saying, I feel really afraid when the news is on constantly, and that's something true. Or maybe in this case, if someone does come to you and say, I really want to chat, I need to lean on you, you can say something to the effect of, I feel really stressed out when there's a lot of pressure on me to support one other person. And, that might allow them, instead of the person being asked saying like, oh, I don't have time for that, if they can honestly say, I'm feeling really stressed because this is a huge amount of pressure and I really want to help you, that tells the asker that they care. It's not that they don't care. They really care, but maybe they care so much that there needs to be more of a web, and there's ways that you can kind of work around this. So yeah, and one thing that we have talked about is like, one of the worst things that you can do is pity someone, because actually someone who is dealing with mental health issues or just dealing with isolation, dealing with anything, when it gets to the point that we feel even able to tell someone that we're struggling, there's already been a lot of fight before that. It's not something to feel bad for us or pity us or pick us up like a dying baby bird, but rather it's so great. I have these friends who I can go to and just be like, today sucks. I feel like shit, like whatever. And they're like, oh, that's a bummer. Anything I can do to help? And maybe there is, maybe there isn't. But they certainly never say, oh, I feel so bad for you. I'm like, whoa, you're not ready for the rest of my life then.
Yeah, that is so important. I'm so glad you brought that up because I think it's something that if you haven't gone through mental health struggle, you don't really realize that aspect of like it takes so much energy to get to the point where I'm even talking to you right now and using the word I and depression in the same sentence, right?
Yes.
There's so much work to be celebrated if I am at the point where I'm able to talk about this so openly. And like you said, I think it can be discouraging if we hear someone say, oh, I'm so sorry, or like this any aspect that has a sense of pity, right? And that's such an important topic. And I think when this question of how can we, if someone approaches you for help, how can we support them? I think understanding the way to validate someone without inciting any sort of feelings of pity, or like saying, for celebrating that, like, I'm really glad you told me this, or just equipping ourselves with ways to respond that do acknowledge that this was a very difficult thing to talk about, and like, I'm really honored that this is something that you shared with me.
Yeah. And going back to kind of our topic du jour of why does isolation suck? I think some of the themes that are coming up in this are, one, like people just can't be completely isolated. It's just not possible. It feels awful. There's cases of people going out and doing it, but that's like extreme. They're trying to resort their life sort of things, if that's on purpose, like a retreat. And and the reason that they even do this is that it forces you to face some things that are really hard. Um, and I think a lot of times we feel this need all through grad school of being completely self-sufficient and, figure out the answer and then ask for help. And especially in isolation, there's not people around to ask if you're okay. And I would definitely say talk to people because one, you might be able to help them, and two, you might not notice that you are acting a little bit strange. You might not really notice that your sleep patterns aren't really that healthy or things like that. And this is stuff, and the reason we want to talk about it is not just during COVID, but to be totally honest, isolation is something that is going to happen throughout grad school. And it's so important to think about these things now. And again, it's not just that you're building it for yourself, like you are, hopefully this will benefit you, but months, years, decades from now, you can be the person that other people lean on and they actually learn from. Um, yeah, so Faye, I want to ask, and I will have to wrap up, but just based on how many questions we have gotten, and we're getting, Paheli says, yes, about not pitying. And so good. You would have enjoyed our like hour-long rant last weekend. Um,
Okay.
but I think we're going to have to definitely do more of these. But before we leave, the question I ask all of my guests, no matter what, is what are you interested in learning about regarding this topic? And that can be like interested in terms of Googling, of learning from others, but also self-introspection. Like what piece of isolation in grad school is the stuff that's kind of on your mind or that you've been wanting to talk about more?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think what I want is more people to talk to about this stuff because I think I share my story, for example, moving across the country, and a lot of people do relate to that. And I always love it when other people bring in things that they're also struggling with or new stories of isolation that I haven't really thought about. And then that jumpstarts more conversations about if it's isolation or how we can support each other or just great conversations that we don't get enough of these days or we don't have spaces for these days. So I think when it comes to isolation, I'd like to see more discussion with other people and hear about how other people, if they're struggling, what is it that they're struggling with? How can we help? And just getting more of those conversations out there.
Yeah. Yeah, I love it. Of course, I said, oh, I said we should maybe do these more, and people are jumping in. I, and then lovely, let's see, who was it? Laura Holland said, yes, do more. And then, I mean, if you have the bandwidth to do so, I love this. This is an awesome way to end because that is really the point is that do your best. Your best is not going to look as good as you think it should. Isolation is super hard, but all the things that Faye said about just asking, being okay if you get a no, that's not a reminder of who you are in a bad way. It's actually maybe it's something that is good that that person trusts you enough to say no, that they say, our relationship is good enough that I can say no to you because I know you won't be like deeply offended. Yeah, but everybody hang in there. Faye, thank you so much for coming. This is super awesome. Definitely want to do this again sometime. So your handle is down there below you. Are you comfortable with people reaching out to you on Twitter, asking more questions?
Oh yeah, feel free. My DMs are open, and again, it'll be my bandwidth and ability to respond, but my DMs are open.
Mm, awesome, awesome, awesome. All right. Well, you take care and enjoy the lovely Los Angeles evening. I was like, what time is it? I don't know what day it is. All right.
Uh,
Okay, everybody. Well, thank you so much for tuning in. Oh, I see where the sound is being weird. Sorry about that. Anyway, I'm going to hop off. Thanks so much. Based on your comments, I think we definitely have to do this again. So send us some ideas, drop them down in the comments of this video, and we are going to get to doing that. Let me know, too, if I should have Faye back on. I think I could, should. She's amazing. Okay. Bye, everybody. Have a good whatever day it is today.